The night she disappeared began like any other in the small farming town of Willow Creek. August heat hung heavy over the valley, pressing into the clapboard houses and silos that dotted the landscape. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the smell of cut hay drifted from fields where tractors had worked until sundown. Emily Carter, 17 years old and restless, lingered outside long after her chores were done. She leaned against the split-rail fence at the edge of her family's property, eyes tilted toward the horizon. Beyond the cornfields, the dirt road led into town, where she imagined life had to be louder, brighter, fuller than the quiet grind of farm work. Her parents believed she'd gone up to bed that night. By dawn, her bed was still made, her boots missing from the porch, and Emily was gone. The sheriff's department launched a search that stretched across acres of farmland, through creeks and ditches, barns and abandoned sheds. Neighbors joined, lanterns and flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Dogs picked up her scent near the edge of the Carter property, but lost it where the gravel road met the highway. Rumors spread fast. Some swore they saw headlights pulled over late that night. Others whispered Emily had been planning to run away. But no note was found. No bags were missing. And her best friend, Rachel, insisted Emily had no such plan. "She wouldn't leave without telling me," Rachel told deputies through tears. Something happened to her. Weeks passed. Posters faded on telephone poles. Crops rose and fell. The Carter family's fields grew untended in places as Emily's mother stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the house at all. Her father aged years in months, his shoulders bent under the weight of endless what-ifs. By winter, the search had gone cold, and by the following spring, Emily Carter's name was spoken only in hushed tones, as if the town itself had decided silence was easier than staring into the abyss of what had happened on that hot August night. It wasn't until 2 years later that a chance visit by police to a neighboring farm would unravel the silence. The Callahan place had stood for nearly a century. Weathered barn, wide fields, and a sprawling old farmhouse that had seen better decades. Owned by Harold Callahan, a man in his 60s who kept mostly to himself, the farm had become the subject of gossip. He rarely came into town, except to buy feed or tools, and some claimed he hadn't mended his fences in years. But when county police arrived on a late spring afternoon to serve a routine property notice, one deputy noticed something odd. A heavy wooden door, half hidden beneath brush at the back of the farmhouse. It looked like an old storm shelter or root cellar. The padlock was new, too new. Curiosity turned to suspicion, and suspicion led to a search warrant. What they found when the cellar door was pried open would stop every man on that farm dead, in his tracks. The smell hit first. Damp earth, mold, and something sharper, sour, that clung to their clothes. Flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating stone walls slick with condensation. And then, at the far end of the cellar, the beam of a deputy's light fell on a row of wooden crates stacked against the wall. Inside the first was nothing unusual. Jars of preserves, sacks of potatoes gone soft. But the second held something else. Faded dresses. 7 of them, neatly folded, each tagged with a year written in fading ink. The most recent tag read, 1995. Deputy Mark Reynolds knelt in the dirt floor of the cellar, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. He'd expected spoiled preserves, maybe rusted farm tools or mouse-chewed burlap sacks, things left behind in an old farmer's storehouse. But the dresses, neatly folded, labeled with years as if they belonged to some grim archive. They froze the air in his lungs. He reached out and lifted the top garment carefully. The fabric was brittle, faded from years of storage, but still recognizable. A yellow sundress patterned with tiny daisies. The tag tied to its sleeve read, 1987. Reynolds felt the prickle of gooseflesh under his uniform. Behind him, his partner, Deputy Lane, muttered, "What the hell is this place?" The cellar stretched farther than they'd expected. Each crate seemed older than the last, stacked neatly against the walls in rows. Some contained dresses, others pairs of shoes, small, worn, feminine. It was Lane who spotted the journal, half buried under a pile of cloth. The leather-bound book was brittle, its pages yellowed. Reynolds held the flashlight steady, while Lane flipped it open. The first entries were mundane, detailing crop yields, weather notes, livestock feed. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew erratic. And then, a line that chilled both men. Another one. She was walking the road alone, took her dress. Keepsake Lane slammed the book shut, his face pale. We need to call this in. Now within hours, the farm was swarming with law enforcement. The Callahan property, once a sleepy and neglected spread of corn and cattle, became a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape. State investigators, forensics teams, and news vans converged like vultures. And through it all, Harold Callahan stood on his porch, silent. Neighbors described him as polite, but distant. A man who waved from his truck, but rarely stopped to talk. He'd lived in Willow Creek all his life, inherited the farm from his father, never married. When reporters shouted questions, he didn't answer. When deputies cuffed his wrists, he didn't resist. But when one officer asked him directly about the dresses, Callahan finally spoke. "They're mine," he said simply, and nothing more. The discovery rattled Willow Creek. The town had long buried the disappearance of Emily Carter, just as it had buried the memory of other missing girls over the decades. Now, those old wounds split open. The yellow sundress tagged 1987 matched the description of clothing worn by a girl named Holly Whitman, who vanished on her walk home from church that summer. She'd been 14. The faded plaid dress marked 1992 looked eerily similar to one worn by a 16-year-old from the neighboring county, gone without a trace after a county fair. And the most recent, marked 1995, was a blue cotton dress. Rachel, Emily's best friend, recognized it immediately. She'd seen Emily wearing it the night she disappeared. The town was stunned. For 20 years, families had clung to different explanations. Runaways, accidents, strangers passing through. But now it seemed clear. The predator hadn't come from the outside. He'd been living among them all along. Inside the cellar, investigators found more than dresses. There were buttons, ribbons, even strands of hair tied with string. Each cataloged with disturbing precision, each box labeled in Harold Callahan's neat script. No bodies, no bones, only belongings. It was as though he'd kept trophies. And the question burned through every investigator's mind. If the keepsakes were here, where were the girls? Sheriff Ellis, who had led the futile search for Emily 2 years earlier, stood at the cellar entrance, his broad frame slumped with weariness. He'd served Willow Creek for 30 years and prided himself on keeping the town safe. Now he stared down into the dark, like it was the mouth of hell itself. "How did we miss this?" he whispered. The answer was bitter. Harold Callahan had never left. He didn't prowl highways or truck stops. He didn't charm girls in bars or lure them in cities. He stayed on his farm, quiet, unassuming, trusted. And he let the town look everywhere else, while he buried his secrets beneath their very feet. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. The cellar wasn't just storage. A hidden door at the back, nearly swallowed by years of dirt and brush, revealed stairs that descended further still. Down into darkness. Deputy Reynolds shone his light into the depths and felt his stomach turn. The stairs weren't carved recently. The walls bore old tool marks, as if someone generations ago had expanded the cellar into a labyrinth of chambers. And from below came a smell no one could mistake. Decay. The narrow staircase descended into damp blackness. Deputy Reynolds went first, the beam of his flashlight bouncing over stone walls slick with condensation. Each step creaked under his boots, the smell of rot growing stronger with every breath. Behind him, Two crime scene techs followed with cameras and evidence bags. Sheriff Ellis waited at the top, jaw clenched, watching his men vanish into the dark. The stairs ended at a dirt-packed corridor. The ceiling was low, forcing them to crouch. The air was heavy, sour. Reynolds swept his light across the walls. Scratches. Long, frantic gouges etched into the earth itself. And then the beam landed on something worse. Chains, bolted into the stone. The corridor opened into a chamber. It wasn't large, maybe 12 by 12, but it was enough. In one corner sat a rusted cot, its thin mattress stained dark. A bucket rusted beside it. On the wall above the cot hung a line of dresses, old, rotting fabric. But what stopped Reynolds cold were the carvings. Symbols gouged deep into the stone. Spirals, crosses, words that didn't make sense. Some were names: Holly, Jenna, Emily. Each one scratched into the wall as if by desperate hands. The camera clicked behind him. One of the techs whispered, "Jesus Christ!" Reynolds forced himself forward. His light fell on a small wooden box under the cot. He pulled it free, the hinges squealing. Inside lay teeth. Small, white, dozens of them. Children's teeth. He slammed the lid shut, bile burning his throat. "This wasn't just storage," he said hoarsely. "This was where he kept them." Back upstairs, Sheriff Ellis listened in grim silence as Reynolds described the chamber. When he heard the names carved into the wall, his weathered face crumpled. "God help us," he muttered. "All these years, right here under our noses." The cellar was sealed as a crime scene. Forensics poured in, combing every inch. Journalists swarmed the edge of the farm, their voices carrying across the fields. And through it all, Harold Callahan sat in an interrogation room at the county sheriff's office, silent, hands folded neatly on the table. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked for anything. When pressed about the chamber, he stared at the wall and said only one thing: "You don't want to know." The investigation expanded fast. Detectives dug through decades of missing persons reports, lining them against the years tagged on the dresses. The pattern was undeniable. Every 3 to 5 years, a girl disappeared within a 50-mile radius. Most were written off as runaways or accidents. But now each year matched a dress, a name carved into stone, a tooth hidden in a box. And then came the number that chilled them all. 17 dresses, 17 years marked in Harold Callahan's cellar. But not 17 victims. 21 names were carved into the walls, which meant 4 were unaccounted for. Meanwhile, the Carter family sat in stunned silence as deputies broke the news. They'd lived 2 years in agony, clinging to hope Emily might walk through the door one day. Now they learned her name was carved into the wall of a cellar less than 3 miles from home. Her mother collapsed. Her father raged, pounding his fists until his knuckles split. Rachel, Emily's best friend, sat rigid in the corner, her eyes wide and empty. She whispered, "I told you she didn't run away." Public fury consumed Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once waved to Harold, Callahan now shouted at news cameras, swearing they'd always suspected something. Former classmates remembered odd looks, quiet behavior, but none of them had spoken up. And now, they realized, the predator had lived among them for decades. Forensics pressed deeper into the tunnels. What began as one chamber expanded into 3. Each was worse than the last. The second chamber held bones, not complete skeletons, just fragments, scattered, mixed with dirt. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae. Too many to count. The third chamber was empty. Empty, except for a single message scrawled in white chalk across the wall. "Not done yet." Sheriff Ellis read the words himself, standing in the beam of a flashlight, his face pale. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "This is a confession." And as he spoke, he realized something that twisted his stomach. If Callahan had been killing for 20 years, if he'd always left a mark, then the 4 missing names didn't mean old victims lost to time. It meant there were girls unaccounted for, girls who might still be out there, alive. The narrow staircase descended into damp blackness. Deputy Reynolds went first, the beam of his flashlight bouncing over stone walls slick with condensation. Each step creaked under his boots, the smell of rot growing stronger with every breath. Behind him, 2 crime scene techs followed with cameras and evidence bags. Sheriff Ellis waited at the top, jaw clenched, watching his men vanish into the dark. The stairs ended at a dirt-packed corridor. The ceiling was low, forcing them to crouch. The air was heavy, sour. Reynolds swept his light across the walls. Scratches, long, frantic gouges etched into the earth itself. And then the beam landed on something worse. Chains, bolted into the stone. The corridor opened into a chamber. It wasn't large, maybe 12 by 12, but it was enough. In one corner sat a rusted cot, its thin mattress stained dark. A bucket rusted beside it. On the wall above the cot hung a line of dresses, old, rotting fabric. But what stopped Reynolds cold were the carvings. Symbols gouged deep into the stone. Spirals, crosses, words that didn't make sense. Some were names: Holly, Jenna, Emily. Each one scratched into the wall as if by desperate hands. The camera clicked behind him. One of the techs whispered, "Jesus Christ!" Reynolds forced himself forward. His light fell on a small wooden box under the cot. He pulled it free, the hinges squealing. Inside lay teeth. Small, white, dozens of them. Children's teeth. He slammed the lid shut, bile burning his throat. "This wasn't just storage," he said hoarsely. "This was where he kept them." Back upstairs, Sheriff Ellis listened in grim silence as Reynolds described the chamber. When he heard the names carved into the wall, his weathered face crumpled. "God help us," he muttered. "All these years. Right here under our noses." The cellar was sealed as a crime scene. Forensics poured in, combing every inch. Journalists swarmed the edge of the farm, their voices carrying across the fields. And through it all, Harold Callahan sat in an interrogation room at the county sheriff's office, silent, hands folded neatly on the table. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked for anything. When pressed about the chamber, he stared at the wall and said only one thing: "You don't want to know." The investigation expanded fast. Detectives dug through decades of missing persons reports, lining them against the years tagged on the dresses. The pattern was undeniable. Every 3 to 5 years, a girl disappeared within a 50-mile radius. Most were written off as runaways or accidents. But now each year matched a dress, a name carved into stone, a tooth hidden in a box. And then came the number that chilled them all. 17 dresses. 17 years marked in Harold Callahan's cellar. But not 17 victims. 21 names were carved into the walls, which meant 4 were unaccounted for. Meanwhile, the Carter family sat in stunned silence as deputies broke the news. They'd lived 2 years in agony, clinging to hope Emily might walk through the door one day. Now they learned her name was carved into the wall of a cellar less than 3 miles from home. Her mother collapsed. Her father raged, pounding his fists until his knuckles split. Rachel, Emily's best friend, sat rigid in the corner, her eyes wide and empty. She whispered, "I told you she didn't run away." Public fury consumed Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once waved to Harold Callahan now shouted at news cameras, swearing they'd always suspected something. Former classmates remembered odd looks, quiet behavior, but none of them had spoken up. And now, they realized, the predator had lived among them for decades. Forensics pressed deeper into the tunnels. What began as one chamber expanded into 3. Each was worse than the last. The second chamber held bones. Not complete skeletons, just fragments, scattered, mixed with dirt. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae. Too many to count. The third chamber was empty. Empty, except for a single message scrawled in white chalk across the wall. Not done yet. Sheriff Ellis read the words himself, standing in the beam of a flashlight, his face pale. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "This is a confession." And as he spoke, he realized something that twisted his stomach. If Callahan had been killing for 20 years, if he'd always left a mark, then the 4 missing names didn't mean old victims lost to time. It meant there were girls unaccounted for. Girls who might still be out there, alive. The interrogation room was silent, but for the hum of the fluorescent light above. Harold Callahan sat with his hands folded, wrists still red from the cuffs. He hadn't asked for water, hadn't asked for a lawyer. He just stared at the blank wall, expression flat, as though waiting for something only he understood. Detective Mara Kinsey leaned forward across the table. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Harold, we've seen the cellar. The dresses, the names, the teeth. We know what you did." Callahan didn't blink. Kinsey placed a photograph on the table. Emily Carter, smiling in her blue cotton dress. "You took her," Kinsey pressed. "You took all of them. 17 dresses, 21 names. Where are the others?" For a long moment, Callahan was still. Then his lips twitched, curling into the faintest smile. "Not mine," he whispered. Back at the farm, forensics combed every inch of soil, every hidden root cellar chamber. The bones were cataloged, boxes of remains filling tables under floodlights. Anthropologists worked around the clock to match fragments to missing girls from the region. By day 3, they had partial matches on 6 victims, but 4 names carved into the wall remained unmatched to any remains at all. Jessica, Lila, Abby, Sarah. No dresses, no bones. Nothing but names scratched by desperate hands. And that absence gnawed at the investigation. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, their stories framing Willow Creek as the newest house of horrors. National outlets picked up the case. Cameras shoved into grieving families' faces. News anchors speculated about serial killers hiding in plain sight. But behind the frenzy, something darker churned. Rachel, Emily's best friend, received a note slipped under her family's door. No signature, just 3 words in scrawled handwriting. "She's not gone." Rachel showed the sheriff, trembling. But Ellis couldn't tell if it was a cruel prank or something more. Because in his gut, he knew one thing. If those 4 names carved into Callahan's wall belonged to girls still alive, every second mattered. Detective Kinsey pressed harder in interrogation. "You didn't act alone, did you?" she asked, voice steady. "The journal, the cellar. It goes back further than you. Who else was involved?" Callahan chuckled softly, the sound dry and hollow. "You think I started it?" His eyes lifted at last, meeting hers. They were pale, watery, but sharp. "You think I built those tunnels?" Kinsey's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" Callahan leaned back, chains rattling on his wrists. "My father showed me the cellar when I was a boy. Said it was for storage, but I knew better." He smiled faintly. "It was never mine to begin with. I was just keeping it alive." The revelation spread like fire through the department. If Callahan spoke the truth, the cellar's history stretched back further than anyone imagined. Maybe decades, maybe generations. Sheriff Ellis gathered his team in the briefing room. Maps of the Carter and Callahan farms spread across the table. "Harold's father died in 79, Ellis said, his voice gravel. "If the cellar goes back that far, then these disappearances could go back further too. Long before Emily. Long before Holly." A deputy whispered, "How many girls are we talking about?" Ellis couldn't answer. Meanwhile, Rachel Carter couldn't shake the note. She lay awake at night, staring at her ceiling, hearing Emily's laugh in her memory. The scrawled words burned in her mind. "She's not gone." On the 4th night after the cellar discovery, Rachel slipped out of her parents' house and walked to the edge of the Callahan farm. Police tape fluttered in the breeze. Floodlights still illuminated the yard. But at the far edge of the field, where the corn was high and uncut, darkness stretched unbroken. She swore she heard it then. A voice, faint, muffled, calling her name. Inside the investigation tent, Deputy Reynolds flipped through photographs of the cellar walls. Something about the scratches bothered him. He enlarged one image. The name Sarah, etched into stone, looked newer than the others. Cleaner lines, less erosion. He compared it against the name Holly, carved deep and worn. Different times, different years, maybe even different hands. He leaned back, stomach churning. Someone had been in the cellar more recently than Callahan admitted. The next morning, a farmer 2 counties over reported something strange. His root cellar, unused for years, had its padlock cut clean. Inside, he found nothing missing, nothing broken, except for one thing carved into the wall. A name. Emily. The call came in just after dawn. Sheriff Ellis was at his desk, nursing bitter coffee, when Deputy Reynolds burst into the office, breathless. "Another carving," Reynolds said, dropping photos onto the desk. Ellis squinted at the glossy prints. The wall of an old cellar, rough stone and dust, and carved deep into it, Emily. His jaw tightened. "Where?" "2 counties over. Henderson Farm. Abandoned for years. Farmer went in last night and found the lock cut. Nothing missing. Just this." Ellis leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Which means either Harold's been holding out on us, or someone else is still working." Detective Mara Kinsey drove straight to Henderson's farm. The root cellar was smaller than Callahan's, but the carving was fresh. No dust in the grooves. Whoever had done it had been there recently. She ran her fingers across the letters. They weren't frantic scratches like the names in Callahan's chamber. These were deliberate, purposeful. It wasn't a girl carving her own name in desperation. It was a message, left for them. Back at the county jail, Harold Callahan smirked when confronted with the photos. "Not mine," he said simply. "You expect us to believe someone else broke into another cellar just to write her name?" Kinsey snapped. Callahan's watery eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time in days, he looked alive. "They never stopped," he whispered. The team dug into Henderson Farm's history. It had belonged to the Henderson family since the 1930s. Records showed a long line of fathers and sons. The current owner had inherited it after his father passed last year. When investigators spoke with him, he mentioned something odd. "My father used to say never to go down in that cellar after dark. Said it was bad luck. I always thought it was just old country superstition. Guess not." In the days that followed, more reports trickled in. A padlock broken at an unused grain storage site. A storm shelter pried open. Each time, investigators found the same thing: names carved into stone. Jessica, Lila, Abby, the missing 4. It was as if someone was taunting them, moving across the county, leaving breadcrumbs. Rachel Carter's parents tried to shield her from the news, but she already knew. She'd been at the edge of the Callahan farm that night for a reason. Because she'd heard Emily's voice. And now the names were appearing again, fresh, as though Emily and the others were still out there. Rachel began keeping a notebook, recording every whisper she thought she heard. Every place she swore her best friend's presence lingered. She told no one. Not yet. The FBI was called in. Agents swarmed the county, their suits a stark contrast to the mud and barns of Willow Creek. They pressed Harold Callahan harder. "Who is still doing this?" But Harold only smiled. "It was never just me," he said. "It's always been the cellar." "What cellar?" "All of them." Detective Kinsey scoured Harold's old journals for clues. Between rambling notes about weather and livestock, one phrase repeated over and over. "The ground remembers." Kinsey underlined it, her pen shaking. What did he mean? That every farm, every root cellar in the county carried the same curse? Or that others, men like Harold, had taken up the same grim ritual across generations? Either way, it explained what terrified her most. Harold Callahan's arrest hadn't stopped anything. It had only stirred it awake. One evening, As investigators regrouped in the Callahan farmhouse, a deputy burst in. His face was pale, his voice shaking. "We found something in the east field." Near the tree line, they followed him into the fading light. There, in the dirt, lay a dress. Blue cotton, faded, Emily's. And beneath it, dug shallow into the soil, was a trapdoor. The trapdoor was half buried beneath a mat of weeds and years of soil. A square of rotted wood framed in rusted iron hinges. The deputies circled it cautiously, boots crunching the gravel. Sheriff Ellis crouched low, brushing dirt from the edges. His chest was tight. "Nobody touch it yet," he said. "We don't know what's down there." But he already knew. The blue cotton dress lying across it wasn't coincidence. It was Emily's. Someone wanted them to find this. When the forensics team pried the door open, a rush of stale, sour air burst out. It reeked of mold and something worse. Something metallic, rotten. Beneath the door, a ladder descended into darkness. Detective Kinsey tightened the strap of her flashlight and peered down. "Another cellar," she muttered. Ellis's jaw clenched. "No, this is something else." The ladder creaked as Kinsey descended first, her light swinging over rough earthen walls. The chamber below was larger than the ones they'd seen in the original cellar. The dirt floor sloped into a crude tunnel, timber beams barely holding up the ceiling. The smell grew stronger the deeper she went. When Ellis and Reynolds joined her, their beams converged on the far wall. Carvings again. But these weren't names. They were dates, each etched into the stone, deep grooves carved with care. And beneath the most recent year, the words, "Still here." The chamber stretched into a tunnel that wound beneath the Callahan fields. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't Harold's work alone. Some sections were old, walls shored with ancient lumber, wood dark and slick with rot. Other sections looked newer, dug by hand within the last decade, fresh cuts still sharp. Generations had worked here, expanding, preserving. Reynolds whispered what they were all thinking. "This isn't one man's cellar. This is a network 50 yards in." They found the first side chamber. It was empty, save for a small wooden chair and a chain bolted to the wall. The floor bore drag marks, as though something, or someone, had been pulled in and out over and over. Another 20 yards, a second chamber. This one held a mattress. Stained, filthy, fibers torn from desperate fingernails. On the wall above it, words were carved deep, the letters jagged and frantic. "Let me go." The team moved cautiously, radios crackling as they called for backup. But the tunnels distorted sound. Voices echoed wrong, bouncing back, twisted and warped. At one point, Reynolds froze. He swore he heard movement ahead. Footsteps. The others stopped, straining their ears. But the tunnel was silent. Too silent. At the third chamber, Kinsey's flashlight beam froze on something in the corner. A shoe. Small. Pink canvas. Next to it, a recent water bottle. Dust barely clinging to the plastic. Kinsey's heart thudded. "This isn't old." She turned to Ellis. "Sheriff, someone's been down here recently." Up above, news of the discovery spread fast. Reporters swarmed the edges of the farm, their questions shouted over one another. Families of missing girls gathered, desperate for answers. And through it all, Harold Callahan sat in his cell at the county jail, humming softly to himself. When Kinsey burst into the interrogation room, slamming the pink shoe onto the table, his humming stopped. "Where is she?" Kinsey demanded. "Where is Emily Carter?" Callahan looked at the shoe, then at her. And for the first time, he laughed. Low, slow, cold. "She's where the others are," he said. "She's part of the ground now." That night, Kinsey couldn't sleep. She sat hunched over maps of the county, tracing every farm with a root cellar, every abandoned homestead. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't one predator, one man. It was a tradition, passed from father to son, farm to farm, and 4 names were still unaccounted for. Girls who might still be alive. Near midnight, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered, voice hoarse. "Kinsey." On the other end, a whisper. A girl's voice. "Help me." The line went dead. Detective Mara Kinsey sat frozen with the phone still pressed to her ear, long after the line went dead. The voice hadn't been a prank. She was sure of it. It was faint, desperate, trembling, and it sounded like Emily. By dawn, Kinsey was back at the sheriff's office, hollow-eyed but determined. Sheriff Ellis looked just as worn, but when she told him about the call, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, he reached into a folder and slid a sheet across the desk. Phone records. The call had pinged off a tower near the western edge of the county, close to the Whitaker farm, abandoned since the 1980s. Another farm. Another cellar. Ellis rubbed his temples. "How many of these damn things are we going to find?" Kinsey's voice was grim. "As many as it takes." They assembled a task force that morning. Deputies, state police, even 2 FBI agents still lingering from the Callahan investigation. The Whitaker farm was 20 miles of back roads and fields. The house was collapsing in on itself, windows broken, roof sagging. The barn leaned like a drunk against the horizon. But the cellar was intact. Another padlock, another door. When the lock was cut and the door pried open, the smell that rose was all too familiar. Damp soil, mildew, and the faint, unmistakable stench of decay. Flashlights swept across stone steps. Sheriff Ellis swallowed hard. "All right, let's go." The tunnel beneath the Whitaker farm was narrower than Callahan's, but it ran deep. The walls bore the same tool marks, the same carved spirals. Kinsey led the way, her flashlight trembling over words scratched into the dirt. "Please. Hungry. God help me." Her throat tightened. They kept girls here too. At the first chamber they found bones. Not scattered this time, arranged. A circle of skulls, each facing outward. Ribs and femurs stacked neatly in the center like firewood. One of the deputies gagged. Another whispered a prayer. Kinsey forced herself to keep moving. She had to. The second chamber was empty, except for a small wooden box, almost identical to the one beneath Callahan's farm. Inside, a lock of hair. Blonde, tied with a blue ribbon. The third chamber stopped them cold. Because there, on a rotted mattress, lay a girl. Alive. She was filthy, skeletal, eyes wide with terror. Her wrists were chained to the wall, her lips cracked and bleeding. She flinched when the lights hit her, shielding her face. Kinsey rushed forward, kneeling. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "Emily." For a split second, Kinsey's heart soared, until she looked closer. Not Emily Carter. Another girl. Younger, maybe 15. Too young to be Emily. "Who are you?" Kinsey asked gently. The girl's lips trembled. "Abby." Kinsey froze. Abby. One of the 4 missing names. She was alive. The chains were cut, the girl wrapped in blankets and carried out into the morning sun. Reporters shouted, cameras flashing, as Abby was rushed into an ambulance. For a moment, the town allowed itself to hope. One survivor. After all these years. But Abby's first words at the hospital turned that hope to ash. "They're still down there," she whispered to the nurse. "The others. The ones he didn't finish." Meanwhile, back in the county jail, Harold Callahan sat alone in his cell. When the guard delivered his dinner tray, Harold pushed it aside. Then he smiled, whispering to himself. They finally found one. Took them long enough. That night, Kinsey replayed Abby's words again and again. The others. The others. How many farms were connected by these tunnels? How many families had carried on this secret? And how many girls were still alive, waiting in the dark? Abby Whitman woke screaming the first night in the hospital. Nurses rushed into her room, alarms blaring, but she fought them off. eyes wild, hands clawing at the IV lines in her arms. It took a sedative to calm her, but even then, she mumbled in her sleep, words half-formed, terrifying. Don't let him take me back. The voices in the dirt. The ones in the walls. Detective Mara Kinsey sat outside her room the next morning, notebook balanced on her knee, waiting. When Abby finally woke, she was pale and trembling, but her eyes were clear. "Are you real?" Abby asked softly. "Yes," Kinsey said. "You're safe now." "I'm Detective Kinsey. I need to ask you some questions." Abby's lips trembled. "Safe?" "Nobody's safe. Not if the cellars are still open." The interview stretched for hours. Abby's voice wavered, but the words spilled out like poison drawn from a wound. She had been taken 3 months earlier, walking home from a bus stop after school. A man in an old truck pulled alongside her. She remembered the smell of gasoline, the rag pressed over her mouth. When she woke, she was chained in the cellar. At first, she thought she was alone. But at night, she heard voices. Girls crying in other chambers, whispers through the walls. "Sometimes they were right next to me," Abby said, staring into the distance. "Sometimes, deeper. Like the ground itself was alive. I don't know if they were real. But I think some of them were." Kinsey leaned forward. "Did you ever see Emily Carter?" Abby hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. "She talked to me." Through the wall, Kinsey's pulse quickened. "Is she alive?" Abby's eyes filled with tears. She was. But then one night, the voices went quiet. All of them. Except his whose, Kinsey pressed. The man. Not the old one. A different one. Younger Kinsey froze. "You're saying Harold Callahan wasn't the one who kept you?" Abby shook her head violently. "No. He came sometimes. But there's another. He's still out there." The revelation hit the investigation like a bomb. For weeks, everyone had believed Harold Callahan was the predator, maybe part of a legacy of predators. But Abby's testimony suggested something worse. Harold wasn't alone, and his arrest hadn't stopped the crimes. Sheriff Ellis convened a task force that night. Deputies, FBI agents, Kinsey Reynolds. They sat around a long table littered with maps of the county. Kinsey pointed to the Henderson and Whitaker farms. 2 confirmed secondary cellars, both active, both connected to missing girls. Abby's survival proves at least one other captor is involved. Ellis rubbed his temples. "So, what are we looking at here? A copycat? An accomplice?" "Neither," Kinsey said. Her voice was cold, steady. "We're looking at a network. A tradition. This isn't one man. It's generational." Meanwhile, Rachel Carter sat on her bed, notebook open, scribbling furiously. She hadn't told anyone about the whispers she still heard, about Emily's voice, calling to her at night. But Abby's rescue only convinced her more. Emily was alive. Somewhere. Rachel traced the names, Emily, Jessica, Lila, Sarah, over and over on the page. She circled Emily's name until the paper nearly tore. "I'm coming for you," she whispered. "I'll find you myself." Back at the Callahan farm, the tunnels sprawled further than anyone had realized. Teams mapped passageways for days, discovering forks and chambers stretching for miles beneath the soil. Some ended abruptly, walls caved in. Others were boarded up, and one led straight toward the Henderson farm. The cellars weren't separate. They were connected. When Kinsey confronted Harold Callahan with the discovery, he finally broke his silence. "You think you can map it?" he sneered. "You think you can close it up with tape and dirt? You don't understand. It's older than me. Older than my father. The ground's always been hungry. We just fed it." Kinsey slammed her hands on the table. "Who's still out there, Harold? Who has Emily?" He leaned forward, eyes shining with a terrible kind of pride. "My son." The room went still. Kinsey's breath caught. "You don't have a son." Harold smiled faintly. "Not one you ever knew about." That night, as rain lashed the county, Sheriff Ellis stood at the edge of the Callahan fields, staring into the dark where the tunnels ran unseen beneath his feet. He had spent 30 years protecting Willow Creek, priding himself on knowing every family, every secret. But now, he realized the truth. The biggest secret had been right under him all along. And if Harold Callahan's son was alive, then the nightmare wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Rain hammered the windows of the sheriff's office, a storm that felt biblical in its weight. Detective Mara Kinsey sat at the long table littered with maps, photographs, and hand-scribbled notes. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she hadn't moved. The word kept echoing in her head. Son. Harold Callahan's son. A ghost no one knew existed, suddenly given flesh by a predator's smug grin. Sheriff Ellis walked in, rain dripping from his hat brim. He looked older than his 60 years, skin gray with exhaustion. "We've dug through every record," he said, dropping a folder onto the table. "No birth certificate. No school enrollment. Nothing. If Harold had a son, he kept him hidden." Kinsey flipped through the folder. It was empty of answers. What about rumors? Neighbors? Ellis shook his head. People said he kept to himself. Nobody ever saw a kid. Kinsey leaned back, jaw tight. Then he raised him down there. In the tunnels, Ellis didn't argue. At the hospital, Abby Whitman stirred uneasily in her sleep. She'd survived weeks in the cellar, but her body was still frail, her mind shattered. Kinsey stood at her bedside the next morning, voice gentle. "Abby, you told me there was another man. Younger. Do you remember anything else? His face? His voice?" Abby shivered. Not his face. He wore a mask, but his hands, they were young. Not old like Harold's. Kinsey pressed. "Did he ever call himself anything?" Abby's lips trembled. "He called himself Caleb." That name electrified the task force. Deputies searched records, hunting for any trace of a Caleb Callahan. Nothing. But one dusty ledger, pulled from the Callahan farmhouse attic, held a single entry written in Harold's tight scrawl. Caleb, born 1980, belongs to the Cellar. The news hit Rachel Carter harder than anyone. She had spent years waiting, grieving, hoping. And now the truth was slipping closer. Emily hadn't vanished into thin air. She hadn't run away. She had been swallowed by a darkness passed from father to son. Rachel sat on her bedroom floor, notebook open. She traced Emily's name with shaking fingers. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell the police. She just packed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and her notebook into a backpack. And at midnight, she slipped out of the house. The storm had passed, but the ground was soft with mud. Rachel walked the back roads, heart pounding, until she reached the edge of the Callahan property. The floodlights were gone. Now. The yellow tape sagged in the wet wind. Rachel ducked beneath it and crossed the fields toward the trapdoor. Her flashlight beam quivered on the rotted wood. She pulled it open and climbed down. Meanwhile, Kinsey and Reynolds sat in the sheriff's office piecing together Caleb's trail. "If he was born in 1980, he'd be in his 30s now," Reynolds said. "That means half these disappearances could have been him, not Harold." Kinsey nodded grimly. "And if he's still using the tunnels, he knows them better than we do." "He could be anywhere," Reynolds hesitated. "What if Rachel's right?" Kinsey frowned. "Right about what?" "That Emily's still alive. Abby swears she talked to her through the walls. Maybe Caleb's keeping her." Kinsey's stomach twisted. Hope and horror in equal measure. Deep underground, Rachel's flashlight beam cut through the dark. The tunnels smelled of mold and rust. Water dripped somewhere ahead. Her notebook shook in her hands. She whispered into the silence. "Emily? Can you hear me?" At first, only echoes. Then, soft, faint. "Rachel." Rachel froze. Her breath caught. "Emily?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Don't come down here." Back at the station, Kinsey's phone buzzed. An unknown number again. She answered sharply. "Kinsey." Static filled the line. Then a man's voice, low, rough. "You're too late. She's already mine." The line went dead. The tunnels swallowed Rachel whole. Her flashlight beam swung wildly across rough walls, catching damp stone, jagged carvings, rusted chains bolted to the earth. Each step deeper was a step away from safety, yet she couldn't turn back. Because she had heard Emily's voice, and Rachel had promised she would find her. Above ground, alarms went off in the sheriff's office. A deputy monitoring surveillance feeds from the Callahan property swore he saw movement near the trapdoor. Sheriff Ellis's blood ran cold. "It's Rachel," he muttered. Detective Kinsey grabbed her jacket and bolted for the door. "If she's in those tunnels alone, she won't last an hour." Within minutes, a convoy of patrol cars tore through the back roads, red and blue lights cutting across the darkness. Rachel pressed on, her notebook clutched against her chest. The whispers seemed to guide her now, threads of sound weaving through the black. "Rachel!" She turned a corner, breath catching. A chamber opened before her, larger than any she'd seen. On the wall, a fresh carving. Caleb. And beneath it, a crude spiral dug deep into the stone. Her heart thundered. "Emily!" she called. From the shadows came a figure. Not Emily. A man. He stepped into her beam of light, tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a crude leather mask stitched with twine. His hands were bare, young, strong. Rachel stumbled back, her knife trembling in her grip. "Caleb!" she whispered. The man tilted his head, like an animal studying prey. Then his voice rumbled, deep and mocking. "You shouldn't have come." Above, Kinsey and the deputies descended into the tunnels, guns drawn, voices echoing. "Rachel!" Kinsey shouted. "Where are you?" But the tunnels warped sound. Their calls came back twisted, overlapping, and somewhere ahead, a girl's scream ripped through the dark. Rachel ran, flashlight beam jerking wildly. Caleb's footsteps thundered behind her, closing in. She darted into a side passage, lungs burning, and slammed the beam against the walls. Names covered them. Hundreds of them. Girls she'd never heard of. Girls long forgotten. The network wasn't just Willow Creek. It had spread everywhere. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a family secret. It was an inheritance of horror. Caleb's hand shot out, seizing her wrist. The flashlight clattered to the ground, rolling, its beam cutting across his mask. Rachel screamed, stabbing blindly with the knife. The blade sank into flesh. Caleb roared, shoving her hard against the wall. Her head cracked stone, stars bursting in her vision. "Stupid girl," he snarled. "You think you can stop me? I was born here. I am the Cellar." Then voices filled the tunnel. Deputies shouting, footsteps pounding. Kinsey's voice, fierce and desperate. "Rachel!" Caleb hissed, shoving Rachel aside. He melted into the shadows, gone before the lights found him. Kinsey reached Rachel, pulling her up, her hands shaking. "Are you hurt?" Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. "He's real. He's here. He has Emily." The team searched the tunnels for hours, but Caleb was gone. The chambers stretched too far, too deep. They found traces, chains still warm, scraps of food, footprints in the mud, but no captives, no Emily. Only the sense that someone was always just one step ahead. By dawn, the exhausted team regrouped above ground. Rain had stopped, leaving the fields slick with mist. Sheriff Ellis stared at the trapdoor as if it might speak. His voice was gravel when he finally said, "We'll keep looking. We'll never stop. But the truth is, this isn't over." Not by a long shot, Kinsey nodded grimly. She'd seen the walls of names. She understood now. Harold Callahan was just one link in a chain. Caleb was another. And the network, the inheritance, was still alive. Rachel sat wrapped in a blanket at the edge of the field, notebook clutched tight. Her head throbbed, but she barely noticed. Because when the deputies had led her out of the tunnels, she'd heard it one last time. A whisper. Rachel. I'm still here. Emily. Rachel closed her eyes, tears streaking her face. I'll find you, she whispered back. I swear it. That night, in the county jail, Harold Callahan smiled when the guard brought his meal. They met him, he murmured. They finally met him. The guard frowned. Who? Harold's grin widened, his eyes glinting with madness. My boy. In the tunnels beneath Willow Creek, Caleb stood alone in the dark, blood dripping from his arm where Rachel's knife had struck. He pressed a hand to the wall, breathing deep. The earth seemed to breathe back, and from somewhere deeper, voices rose, soft, crying, endless. The cellar was alive, and it was far from finished.